Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming over and your interest to listen to PPP program in the Philippines, particularly on education and what we were doing so far to expand PPP inputs into this sector. I was asked to put out some slides providing the context about how we're proceeding with this whole agenda of public-private partnerships in new sectors such as education. But before that, may I provide some quick context on the PPP program in the Philippines, how we've started and where we are right now, and where is the education sector in all of this big, ambitious program that will engage private sector over the long term. Okay, next. As you all know, the PPP program is a major development agenda in the Philippines. We have had some semblance of private sector participation even prior to this administration. As you know, we have had the BOT law as early as the 90s. During the Estrada administration, we referred to it as private sector participation, or PSP. So in other words, even before this new era of PPPs, we have already looked at private sector as partner in development. In fact, in the Philippine Constitution, there's a very clear line there that says the state recognizes the role of private sector in development. And when we say development, we just don't refer to the hard infrastructure projects that we have been doing as PPP, the rail and roads, but even development projects such as ICTs and schools and public hospitals, etc. And so it's a priority or a major development strategy of this administration. But we also look at PPP as a procurement option. In the Philippines, we have a procurement law. That's our basic guidance in procuring inputs from private business, the private sector. But for PPPs, we have a defined policy that provides for us as well a procurement methodology. We also look at PPP as a financing option. We look at it as our other resource alongside official development assistance and our limited appropriations or our budget. And so this have all been incorporated into our development program. And in fact, there's a center that's tasked to take the lead in all of this, coordination and monitoring function, and that's our office, the PPP Center. Next slide, please. As I said, there's I think compared to our neighbors in the region, the Philippines is one with a more defined policy framework that outlines some requirements and some policy provisions on the role of private sector. We don't have a PPP law, but we have a BOT law, and we have amended its implementing guidelines recently in 2012 to provide a more expansive and a more flexible set of options for private sector engagements other than just BOTs. Other related laws have also been enacted to facilitate more enhanced, more flexible engagement with the private sector. A major policy program right now, or agenda right now, just to amend the law into the PPP Act. It's a major policy initiative, and we hope to have it out by this Congress that would put out a comprehensive law on PPPs in the Philippines. Next slide. Alongside that framework, that policy framework, is a well-defined set of institutions with very clear mandates on this whole PPP program. In the Philippines, not all agencies or ministers in your countries, we call them departments in the Philippines, not all of them can do PPPs. They have to have the mandate to do it. So we refer to them as the contracting or implementing agency. They're the public in the public-private arrangements. These are line agencies, departments or ministers. The government corporations under them, or in the region, some refer to them as the SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And of course, the local government units that evolve in the centralized setup in the Philippines has enabled as well our local governments to be contracting entities. Of course, state colleges and universities, they have charters on their own and they can enter into PPPs. Approving and regulation of this, approvals and regulation of these projects are interagency. There's particularly the Interagency Investment Coordination Committee that reviews and checks all of these projects consistent with our sectoral plans and requirements from finance, environment, etc. And as I said, there's a center in the middle of all of that, orchestrating the whole set of action in all of these areas of preparation, review, approvals, procurement. At the agency level, when they have a project already ready for tender, they would have to set up a pre-qualification bidding and awards committee. I think that's what's unique in the Philippines compared to our neighbors. We have a dedicated procurement unit or group that is put together simply for particularly for this PPP